But so without any further ado, I'll turn it over to David Rudduck with his presentation on prepare for a data breach. Thanks.
Cool. Thank you very much. So just my topic today is, how to prepare your small to mid-sized business for a data breach on a budget. The reason for this is, 6 years ago when I started coming to AusCERT, I didn't know as much. I'm still a beginner, but I know a lot more than I did then. And it made me realize there's a lot of other people out there who they don't know what you don't know, and it often ends up getting you into trouble. So our goal is to try and maybe give some foundations for those people who are sort of starting out in the industry, and because the number of incidents is increasing. As mentioned, I really like interaction and engagement. And because I can't see you, if you would enter your questions into the Q&A box as we go, I'll do my best to answer them. Just a little bit about me. I started my company at 22 years of age, in 2000, so 20 years ago. Consulted with and worked for a large range of local, national, international companies. Certified professional by the Australian Computer Society, certified information systems security professional, member of the Australian Information Security Association, and more recently a GIAC certified forensic examiner and forensic analyst. A little bit about my company. About 2 years ago, we were engaged by CFC Underwriting, which are one of the big cyber insurers, to provide their insured with incident response, digital forensics, data cataloging services, and to their insured. So I was reading the Q&A at the same time. So what this has done for us is really provide us with firsthand knowledge of the type of things that lead to an incident, and also the typical challenges that occur, when an incident occurs. And for Campbell, I'm more than happy to provide a copy of the slides. I'll leave my contact details at the end, and I'll also give them to the AusCERT guys. The screen I've got on at the moment, I kind of like, because my little company, which up until recently had about 8 staff, we've now got about 20, is pictured here with the likes of CrowdStrike, KPMG, and Symantec. And I think that's kind of a big call to fame for us as a tiny little Gold Coast business. So just to set the scene, let's look at a typical incident response scenario. First of all, business notices that they're having some IT issues and they give the help desk a call. The IT team begins investigation and the team discovers that servers or a user's mailbox has been compromised. The team continues to investigate and discovers they've had a cyber incident. So the business calls the insurance broker. The insurance broker lodges a cyber insurance claim, and the insurer then responds and assigns an incident response team. And this is typically where things go really well or really badly. The IR team typically will come in and find very little logging is enabled. And funnily enough, Murray's presentation before me was talking about getting more telemetry out of the logging and making sure you're logging the right things. What we often find just trying to do incident response is either the logs have been blown away or they were set at the very bare minimum, and there's really not a lot to go on. We also find the threat actor has been in the system for a considerable amount of time. And in performing their own investigations, the IT team have kind of left their own footprints all over the digital crime scene. And so now we've got a problem where we've got to try and discern between what is actually the threat actor activity and what is regular activity post-incident. This leads to a series of unfortunate events. The forensic investigators are therefore unable to confidently determine whether the threat actor gained access to any sensitive personally identifiable information and or personal health information, and then the business has to notify under the notifiable data breach legislation, which is not a position we really want every business to end up in. It can be avoidable, and today I'm going to try and take you through a couple of things to try and help you position yourself so that if and when you have an incident, you'll be in the best position to walk through that investigation and hopefully come out the other side with a fairly confident result. So what can you do? First of all, and it seems so simple, but create a cyber incident response plan. And I was talking to the guys from AusCERT and also the ACSC on the various Slack channels prior to this. There's a lot of good resources online to give you a boilerplate starting position. Victorian government has one, the Queensland government has one, and actually a lot of cyber insurers will offer templates. So there's really no excuse not to have something. Bottom line, keep it simple. List out who your primary contacts are, vendors and their responsibilities. Make sure everyone understands it. And then run a tabletop exercise at least once a year so that people actually have to go through a scenario where they're experiencing an incident. And I know Ben DeMarco and Steph Lurs went through a really good one the other day. There's people you can engage to do those, and it'll just kind of like a fire drill, get you into the habit of knowing the actions you should take if you have an incident. So there's two scenarios that I really want you to focus on, and the number one type of, or two top incidents that we see that result in a cyber claim and as a result, a data breach. The first one, which I'm sure everyone here has talked about, is business email compromise. And this can happen through phishing, through password stuffing, or a whole range of different ways, legacy protocols, but it is probably the most prevalent cyber incident that we investigate. And the second one is ransomware. And even though we deal with a lot of IT providers when we go in to do our incident response, and they're all focused on the ransomware coming through via email, these days ransomware comes in because people left the door open. And I know there was another presentation earlier where they were talking about, you know, the change in the landscape as a byproduct of COVID-19. And that's really true. Some of the big incidents we worked on post everyone going into ISO were because businesses had to move really quickly to enable their workforce to go remote. And they would stand up remote desktop servers and not securely lock them down. And as a byproduct, you know, users have basic passwords and they get popped. With your response plan as well, I cannot stress enough about how important it is that before you start your investigation, or when you get into your investigation, you realize it's a cyber incident, try, if possible, to make a backup of the system that you're looking at before you go too far. If you do this, then at least you've got as close as near to the incident as possible for the investigators to look at. Quite often, you know, we'll find that the whole system has been encrypted, but because there's a backup taken every hour and it was taken just before the system was encrypted, we've got something to go back to. This takes time, and there are ways to do it, which other presenters have talked about. And there's a lot of really good resources out there, and I'm happy to share a couple of others if anyone pings me on it. The other thing is too, and this is probably teaching some people here how to suck eggs, but don't rush to pull the plug. The old mentality, and we still face it with IT support companies, managed service providers, is this rush to, oh my God, we've had an incident, pull the plug on those systems before it spreads too far. And what we all learn over time is that if you do that, you may actually, first of all, you can't investigate things properly because you've stopped it midway. And second of all, there may be something in memory that you've just lost. And yes, there are forensic artifacts that store parts of things in files, parts of memory in files. But if that system's still online, we've got a better chance of pulling out the full memory and investigating it. And also going on with what Murray was talking about, dial up your logging. You know, one of the biggest things we found in Office 365 is that, yes, Thomas, I would say yank the nick instead in some instances. But yeah, coming back to the slides, dial up your logging. Ensure the unified audit log is enabled for Office 365. The amount of times we've gone in for an investigation for an Office 365 business email compromise and the unified audit log isn't enabled. And without that, you've lost half of the information to be able to perform an investigation. You cannot tell how the threat actor gained access to the mailbox, what actions they performed, what was the method of access, which a lot of reports we review of other incidents, they don't record that, and it's really important. The OAIC really wants to know if it's been accessed by IMAP because you've left a legacy protocol open. That's really important because it could mean that the mailbox was potentially synchronized. There's a really good tool called LogMD that will do, in its free version, an audit of your Windows Server security and logging baselines, and it'll baseline it against NIST and the ASC Essential 8 and all the rest of it, and give you an evaluation of what you should turn on. You can go further with it, and we'll create some actually good forensic information as well. But the free version is great, and it will just give you a really good starting point to work out what do you need to change in your environment. And then the final thing on that with your logging is make sure that at least the Windows security log is sitting at 2 gig. In previous versions of Windows, the Windows logging, the bigger it was, the more memory it consumed. That hasn't been the case for a very long time. It's, people still believe that's the case, but turn it up as big as you can, because as much logging data that is available in the system itself is really, really useful for a forensic purpose. Obviously, if the threat actor has gone in and reset the logs, that doesn't help. Most threat actors will go in and delete the volume's shadow copies. But if there is something there, at least we can deep dive into that. The other thing is as well, because they will reset the logs, is implement some form of log collection, and it doesn't have to be a full-blown SIEM. I would hazard that even something as simple as Elasticsearch can be leveraged as a really good low-cost log collection solution. Keep it on a separate system and aim for 12 months worth of log collection for your firewall, servers, and other key devices. And again, there's some really good resources which I'm happy to share, which will teach you what specifically to monitor for, like the certain event types that you really want to look for, the log on to system, log off from system, administrative privileges used, changes to Active Directory. It's all there in the public domain. It's just that most people aren't using it. And if you want to go all out and implement a full-on SIEM, that's great. But again, we're talking about doing this on a budget, and you can do this for next to nix. And always secure the end user. This is such a silly thing to be say, but we log into some websites and they don't allow us still in this day and age to have passwords longer than 8 characters. We encourage not to have regular password resets. I know there's a constant flip-flap on this one, but a friend of mine, when she started working for us, she came from travel. Her original password was holiday 1. Then when it got rotated, it was holiday 2, and then it was holiday 3, and so on and so forth. And if you force people to constantly change their passwords, they're going to get tired, and they're going to make it really simple for them, because passwords are hard. Love password managers. Some banks don't love password managers. But that's one way of really ensuring that you are helping your team to better their standards. And of course, multi-factor authentication. And I've heard a lot of presenters today talk about, when they were doing red teaming exercises that had multi-factor authentication being implemented or configured properly, they probably wouldn't have gotten as far as they did. We get a lot of pushback from insureds when we go into an incident, particularly when it's an Office 365 mailbox compromise, and we say to them, okay, well, you need to go and immediately enable multi-factor authentication. And quite often the scenario we get back is, well, we're actually in the middle of an evaluation of that, and there's a pilot group of people who are testing it out, but we're getting a lot of pushback from our end users because they don't want an application installed on their phone, and it's such a painless experience now to install something like the Microsoft Authenticator. I was talking to one of the big insurers the other night, and they said they have statistics that prove if multi-factor authentication was enabled on Office 365 mailboxes, the number of claims would go significantly down. It's such a brainless thing, but still we're doing investigations where very large, prominent organizations don't have multi-factor authentication on. And even if it's just their high-risk users, people who are dealing with finances or keeping copies of highly sensitive information, and yet they still don't turn it on because the user feels that it's not frictionless. And of course, empower the users. Like the IT department has typically, and I come from the IT world, has typically been the department of no. And so users have been berated every time they sort of say, hey, is this, and this is that, by the IT team. And we want to get into a world where we actually encourage people to come to you and say, hey, I just got this. Before I click on it, can you check that it's okay? One of the things we did with a lot of our clients is we actually started sending them chocolate bars, and everyone likes chocolate. And what we would say to them is, if you sent us a phishing email that legitimately was a phishing email, we would send you a chocolate bar, and a chocolate bar costs $2. But as a byproduct, we didn't have to go into, helping them, whether it was a virus or, mailbox compromise and all this. Is 5-10 years ago. And it significantly reduced the number of incidents that we're having because people were motivated to get the chocolate bar. And really good question, Paul. I haven't done any research. The question is, have you done any research on password length tolerability on the part of end users? From a cost to crack perspective, 12 characters is way too low nowadays. Yeah, look, it is. We always try and encourage people to use a passphrase. Obviously, a unique one for every single system. But if multi-factor is also tied to it and you don't have things like legacy protocols enabled, so POP3, IMAP, and everything has to go through a modern authenticator, then the chance of a 12-digit password getting popped is a lot less. I guess the problem is a lot of people have been allowed to get away with 4- and 6-digit passwords, and we just want to keep raising the bar up. We don't want to set the bar so high no one can attain it. We want to start just chipping away at that bar and making it more difficult for the cyber criminals. So as I said as well, secure remote access. Everything either needs to be behind an SSL VPN. We repeatedly end up in a debate with IT providers who, when we get involved in it, do you guys have remote desktop open? Oh, yes, we do, but we've got it running on a non-standard port. And as some of the people in the room are aware, I'm sure, there's so many open source tools out there that you can use that will identify what every port is, and finding remote desktop these days is trivial. Plus, you can go to Shodan and it's probably listed anyway. So just using the old security through obscurity is only fooling yourself. Talking about the legacy protocols, inside Office 365, there is an option which can be done globally or on a per mailbox basis. POP and IMAP, which are, for those that don't know, is an old way of accessing your emails. POP3 was sort of a bucket situation. IMAP is a little bit more intelligent in that it was designed for synchronization between multiple devices before we ended up with what we have now, but they're enabled by default, and these things don't support multi-factor authentication. And quite often when we do an investigation into an Office 365 mailbox compromise, the threat actor will move to using IMAP to access the mailbox. And as I said at the start, that means that the threat actor has potentially synchronized part or all of the mailbox. And as it stands currently, Office 365 does not log what part of the mailbox they actually downloaded. So you've sort of got this throw your hands in the air situation where all we know is they could have potentially synchronized it. We just don't know how many. Which of the native Windows VPN options would you recommend? To be honest, I always go for something that's SSL VPN based, which is the open source OpenVPN. A lot of commercial firewalls support that as a basic. Sometimes you have to license it. Some of the more high-end firewalls have their own version. But if you go by, I won't mention brands, but most of them out there will have support for SSL VPN. And yeah, I'd head in that direction. What is the replacement for IMAP? If you haven't moved to Office 365 or something like Google G Suite, you need to. The replacement is generally, it's a web-based synchronization, so it's HTTPS. And Office 365 and Google G Suite use that natively. If you're using Office 365 with Outlook, then it will use HTTPS as opposed to IMAP. but yeah, there really should be very few reasons to continue using IMAP unless you've got some legacy contact relation management system. Then I'd be turning it off globally. The other thing too, put your vendors on notice. We're finding a lot when we go into engagements that, you know, a certain vendor of a particular particular client has essentially been responsible for putting the client at risk. You know, we deal with a lot of third-party software vendors who, because, and no offense to everyone out there, but some software guys think that they know everything about IT and networking and technology, and so they'll encourage clients to enable RDP, and they won't do it with IP whitelisting or any sort of protections. And the client doesn't know any better. They just assume that these people are professional, and they'll do what the provider says. The other thing is too, you know, what happens if, how are they protecting you from a cyber attack? You know, specifically, we had an incident with a piece of software that was modified to change the banking details of you know, someone that they were going to pay. And when we went to do the investigation, we went to the vendor and said, hey, does your application log who made changes to that part of the system? And their answer was, well, only if it's turned on. And we sat there and thought that that should be something that's on by default. And then we get to the other end of the scale where we also have vendors who tell us, no, we don't have some sort of transactional or audit log in our software. And you as the consumer need to really put pressure on the vendors and say, well, you know, what are you doing to help us? Because at some stage something will happen. Another one we dealt with, whenever you walk into the RSL clubs or a lot of those clubs and they scan your driver's license, or you know, how is that stored? And up until recently, it wasn't stored in a very safe and secure way. In fact, one engagement we had, we asked them and they said, oh, it's stored on the client server. And we went to this client and said, well, do you know what it's on? And they said, no, it was just installed for us. And what had happened is the vendor had gone and just mapped a share on a drive and essentially was storing these files on the system. Now, if that system got hacked, it had copies of people's driver's license all over it, and there was just sort of a, you know, pointing the finger in each way. The other thing too is, like, does that software, if it stores sensitive PII or PHI, enforce MFA? And a lot of the accounting software is doing that now, which is great. But there's still a lot of applications out there that don't, and this needs to be a bare minimum. And the final thing with your vendors on that aspect is, do they get an independent penetration test performed on their software, particularly if it's web-facing? There's been a lot of incidents with schools and a few other groups at the moment. And the question is, you know, are they actually testing the code, or is it just something that, you know, they've put together and they're hoping for the best? And a lot of vendors are really, really shy to answer this question. Another thing we see a lot as well is, you know, the managed service provider and managed security service provider. Do they enforce multi-factor authentication when their staff access your system via remote support? So things like TeamViewer, Screen Connect, Splashtop, all those sort of things. We have seen a huge number of incidents where the managed service provider got hacked, and then as a byproduct, the threat actor was able to leverage their remote support tools to then deploy ransomware across all of their clients. So instead of just getting one client, they've got 10 or 20 or 100, which then is a really interesting question. So, you know, does the managed service provider have a cyber insurance policy? Part one. Part two, if all of their clients were hit with ransomware as a byproduct of them being compromised, would their policy hold up? And I'd hazard that most of them won't have a big enough policy to do that. Question is it's worthwhile keeping the remote worker off the network? Use of Splashtop, TeamViewer, etc. would isolate a remote worker's machine, which may be compromised. Yeah, I mean, if you have a quarantine VLAN or something, you can put the machine in so that you know, remote work can be done to it, and it is unable to touch the network. That would definitely be preferable. It seems silly that we have to say this, but everyone needs to make sure they've got an automated offsite backup. And we had an incident the other day, really big business. They obviously got hit with ransomware, and we said to them, okay, well, what's your backup strategy? Oh, well, we replicate to an offsite location. Okay, well, replication isn't backup. If you replicate the ransomware system, you have a backup of a ransomware system. You need something that looks at, and it's not a one size fits all either. You know, certain parts of data for a business are more important than another. Certain things you could probably lose and the business can continue to operate, whereas there's other things the business desperately needs, and if it lost them, it's in a really bad position and either has to pay the ransom or worse. And a business needs to sit down and assess that with their IT person, provider, and work out what is the right strategy for them and make sure it actually goes off site and it's automatic. And it should allow you as well to roll back to previous versions too. And that, as I said earlier, that's become really useful for us in investigations, having the ability to roll back to try and determine sometimes just how long has the threat actor been in the system if we don't have the, you know, the live systems to investigate because they've been encrypted at the disk level, not the file level. The whole VM, the virtual machine, has been encrypted, and there's just nothing for us to look at. And of course, again, I shouldn't have to say this, but if you're not testing your backups, they're useless. It's kind of like not doing a fire drill. You know, people won't know what to do when it happens. Yeah, when you do the pull the NIC, the initial analysis take time and things are not obvious until you go in and look. You create fatigue if you cry wolf every time you see something funny. Of course you do. But there's going to be a small step where you do a little bit of an investigation, and there's going to be certain incidents, and this is something you have to work into your incident response plan and whatever consultant you're working at, where, you know, some pull the network cable out is acceptable. Other things might be a temporary isolation into an isolation network so it can continue to be investigated without impact to the operation. Other things might be just leave it until someone can look at it. But you know, there's different ways to approach every situation, and it's not a one size fits all. And the last one is get cyber insurance. The number of businesses I talk to, because we do a lot of speaking engagements for insurance brokers, and these businesses, they're still not getting cyber insurance. And I'll be honest, when I first heard of cyber insurance, I thought it was a bit of a crock. I couldn't understand why we needed it. But now that I've done a couple of hundred investigations in the last couple of years, I can see where it pays for things. And, you know, I've seen some very, very expensive ransoms. I've seen some very expensive notification campaigns. You know, the cost of investigating, the cost of legal, the cost of having to notify the potentially affected individuals, the PR campaigns around it. And we did a job for a business recently, which was through a broker network. They didn't have insurance, and, you know, it's not a fun conversation to have a chat with someone and say, well, look, you're gonna have to put your hand in your pocket and pull out a significant amount of money that you're never going to see again. And cyber insurance isn't that expensive in the grand scheme of things. And there's some awesome vendors that you essentially get assigned to when you have an incident. It's more than a typical insurance policy. Any other questions? You mentioned yearly tabletop scenarios. Do you have any advice for really small teams? Can you effectively create it for yourself? So what we're actually looking at internally, because we do some training with our consultants, is group exercises. So for those really small businesses, particularly when they're in the financial sector at the moment, they're under scrutiny after the ASIC thing recently, is maybe bringing a group of businesses together who can't afford or don't have the numbers to do an individual a tabletop exercise or training exercise, and have them do it all together. It at least still lets you play it out and understand, and you probably get some insight from working from other businesses because you're collaborating. Cool.
Excellent. Well, look, thank you very much, David. We're going to convene for a little, for about 15 minutes, have an afternoon tea break, and then we'll be back at 2:45 for the afternoon keynote speakers. Thanks very much, David.
Thank you.